Before we begin, tell me where in the world you're reading this from. And if you like stories of courage and second chances, don't forget to hit subscribe. The stagecoach shuddered and came to a grinding halt, with a sound like a great iron animal collapsing. Eleanor Whitby, called Nell by the few who'd earned the right, was flung against the padded seat so hard the breath left her lungs. Red dust filtered through the broken window and settled on the green traveling gown Frederick Langdon had insisted she wear for the trip. She clutched at the parasol on her lap, its lace trembling as the coach lay tilted on the plain outside Iron Hollow. Frederick's ranch manager cursed from the front, the driver muttered, and somewhere beyond the heat, shimmer a whip cracked. Nell's gloves left damp prints on the wood as she slid from the coach. The Wyoming sun hit like judgment. The air smelled of sage and hay, and something wide and uncompromised that made the city-born woman recoil and ache at once. It was then she saw him, a rider cutting across the plain, one enormous horse snorting up red dust. He was tall enough to seem carved out of the horizon, shoulders broad, hair falling in dark waves to the collar of a worn shirt. There was a light in his pale eyes that recalled winter ponds, clear, impossible to look away from. When he pulled the horse to a halt a few yards away, Nell felt something in her chest shift. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was low and steady as weathered timber. "Name's Caleb Mercer. You folks stuck?" "Nell Whitby," she answered, because it felt like the correct thing to do. Thought of Frederick rose like bile. "My husband owns Iron Hollow. We broke a wheel." Caleb dismounted with a grace that belied the raw force of him. He ran large, sun-dark hands over the fractured wheel with surprising tenderness, and Nell knew at once she was watching someone whose hands had learned the difference between breaking things and mending them. They bore the marks of work, not leisure. The contrast between them and Frederick's banker fingers, manicured, careful, made heat pool low in her belly she did not have words for. "My folks work the horses down at the hollow," Caleb said. "Might be a few hours before the driver has this fixed proper. If you don't want to stand in this sun, there's a cabin not far. You're welcome to wait there." Every sensible element of her upbringing told her to refuse. She was a Langdon. She would not be indebted to the hired hand. Yet the thought of baking until the coach was mended, of the corset finally gluing her ribs into silence, made her assent before she'd decided to. "Very well," she said, and when he moved to help her onto his horse, the one motion, his hand at her waist, the reassurance of his arm as she climbed, felt like a promise of air. He rode behind her then, not too close and not too distant, the horse's motion setting them in a private rhythm. The world narrowed to the strike of hoof, the wind playing with the edge of her hat, the scent of leather and sage and the faint smoke of his campfire woven with him. Nell's cheeks flushed and she chastised herself for the way his warmth seemed to melt the cool, practiced shells she wore for Frederick's world. When the cabin appeared, weathered and honest, Caleb brought them down gently. His fingers lingered at her waist as he dismounted, and the silence between them swelled. He looked at her like a man who had all the time in the world and like a man who would not waste it. "You've got dust on your cheek," he said, thumb brushing across her cheek in a feathered sweep that stopped her heart. He offered water. She took it with trembling hands and felt the way he watched her drink like a study. "You've been looking at me funny, Mrs. Whitby," he said, with a crooked humor that made her answer with a laugh that surprised her. "You'll excuse me. I'm unused to this," she said, and the flat lie felt like a relief. Frederick would never have called this place home. Frederick would never think to touch the dust off a lady's face. Frederick measured people by their returns. "You should change," Caleb said. "Can't teach a proper lesson in silk." He returned with a rough bundle, a shirt, a pair of trousers, a leather vest worn by his sister before she went east. The borrowed clothes felt like mutiny. He gave her privacy. Then, when she discovered she couldn't undo her own bodice, never having had to in a house where maids anticipated each motion, she called him. He came in without the show of awkwardness Nell had rehearsed for years when a servant entered. His hands moved with simple competence. There was no shadow of ownership in his touch, only a calm surety that felt, without preface, safe. For a woman who had spent 5 years living as ornament, being handled with practical kindness felt like an act of reclamation. When she stepped from the cabin in the plain shirt and trousers, the clothes swallowed her like a new skin. He paused when he saw her, his gaze warming in a way that put color to the inside of her cheeks. He belted the oversized pants for her, fingers bumping against the soft skin of her waist. "You'll ride better in these," he said. "Ride like a person, and you'll feel like one." Caleb started at the corral with a patient confidence. He spoke to the horse as if it were a friend, moving his hands where they needed to be. "This is Copper," he said. "She's got spirit, but she listens when you show her the way. Don't be afraid to ride the animal, Nell. Let her move you instead of fighting her." The first time he put her on a saddle meant for a steady seat. She felt ridiculous and liberated at once. The city's side saddle rules felt suddenly absurd. The rhythm of Copper beneath her taught her a different cadence. To breathe with each stride, to balance, instead of freeze, to let momentum carry fear away. Caleb's hand rested at her knee, in a guide that felt more like partnership than instruction. "Relax your hips," he coached quietly. "Trust the horse. Trust yourself." When she matched her body to the animal's motion, something unclenched in her. Heat moved through her in a way she'd been taught to fear. It was not simply desire of the flesh. It was the sharp joy of motion, of agency entering muscle. A laugh caught in her throat. She had not known she could feel so unstrangled. By the time they stopped, the sun had dug grooves in the sky, and Nell's face was flushed with exertion. Caleb's hand at her waist steadied her as she climbed down. The touch lingered, deliberate and careful. "You did good," he said. "Very good." "I feel," she began and found only one honest word. "Alive." Into the space between them, he let a small smile fall. "Good," he said. "And when you learn to ride for real, there'll be other things to teach. How to take what you want rather than wait for it." It might have been a metaphor. It might have been a promise. Nell let it rest in the air like a lantern. That night, after the driver finally mended the wheel and took his leave, the hollow rose up on the horizon in its full, extravagant weight. A sprawling house of stone and wood where Frederick, always immaculately dressed, always precise, awaited with the cold calculation of a man who measured affection by benefit. Nell felt the contrast of the two men like weather. Frederick like a room designed to impress. Caleb like the outside, where storms were sudden, and truth even more so. "Welcome home, Eleanor," Frederick said on the porch, his voice polished and indifferent. "I trust your journey was adequate." Caleb tipped his hat and retreated into the distance, the depth in his eyes unreadable. Nell rigged her face into the right shape, polite, grateful, and sank into Frederick's plan for the visit. Meetings about cattle, investments, dinner. He offered her separate quarters as if proving a point. His notion of marriage was tidy, functional, and distant. He had treated their life as an enterprise for years, and nowhere in that business model did hers appear as anything but investment. Dinner assembled the small politics of the territory, ranchers with vested interests, wives in dresses that had survived the trip, and Nell sat at the firing line, practiced in the art of nods and replies. But underneath the practiced niceties, an ember glowed. Caleb had shown her a different language of touch and attention, practical, honest, fierce with respect. Frederick's hand across hers at dinner had been cool and possessive. Caleb's had been warm and asking. She ate and smiled and felt the impossible knot inside her set. When Frederick made a pointed comment about Caleb's temperament, independence being a problem in a man who needed to serve, something in Nell tightened. She could feel the old compliance rising, the reflex to bow and be small for the sake of harmony. But a different voice, newer and louder, insisted she speak. "Competence matters when running a ranch," she said, before she could temper it. "Experience shouldn't be dismissed because someone prefers men who never answer back." The room blinked at her. Frederick's jaw tightened. It was, she realized, the first time she'd contradicted him in public in 5 years. It tasted of iron and of fresh air. Frederick's response was a thin, polite threat. "My dear, you don't understand the management of men in these parts." "Perhaps," she said, "but I intend to learn." The words landed with more consequence than she'd intended. Frederick stewed. At night, when he spoke to her, it was with the paternal condescension of a man who believed he'd purchased obedience. "You will not contradict me," he said in the study's lamplight. "Not in public, not in private. You are what I made of you." "You made me into a thing," she answered quietly. The words startled both of them by their honesty. "I am more than your ledger, Frederick." Anger flashed in his features like a promise. "Do not mistake kindness for weakness." She left without apology and sat in her room as the house settled into the soft, discerning quiet of the valley. Her body still remembered the rhythm of Caleb's hands and the horse's gait. Her lips still tasted of the day's dust. She had crossed a line, and the country was already rearranging itself to accommodate the change. The next morning, when Frederick left for town, Nell found reason to push for more than sightseeing. "I'd like to see the ranch operations," she said at breakfast. "Teach me what matters." He agreed, perhaps amused, perhaps not expecting her to follow through. Caleb was tasked, and when she rode out with him, the promise in his glance was a private vow. They rode into the morning like two conspirators, moving along the barbed perimeter of the hollow, where the world felt immediate and wild. Under the cottonwoods by a slow creek, Caleb halted and turned to her. "You could stay and pretend this never happened," he said softly. "You could return to a life of silk and polite behavior." "I could," she answered, "but I tasted another rhythm. I tasted a life where I move instead of being moved." He reached for her then, and this time their closeness was no longer merely instruction. They kissed, at first tentative as two people stumbling into naming a truth, then with a growing assurance that they had each other's consent. The world narrowed to breath and the press of two bodies against the bark. There was no graphic detail in the way they held one another. Instead, there was urgency and tenderness, a rediscovery of what it meant to be seen and desired as a whole person. That, and the deliberate planning of escape, stood like twin pillars. Between them, the one intimate and redemptive, the other furious and practical. When Frederick returned sooner than expected, his rage was frosted and quick. He had learned something, a house whisper, a traitorous servant, an observant neighbor, and he wore certainty like armor. "You defended him?" he demanded of Caleb in the yard, his voice a coiled thing. "You drew my wife into your hands?" "Nell and I are working the ranch," Caleb said. "She asked me to show her the operations." Frederick's eyes were small, cruel. He strode forward, and the following exchange unfurled like a knot being pulled tight. In a place where law often bent to muscle, Frederick chose leverage over justice. He would, he said, demonstrate the costs of transgression. He would hang the man who'd touched his possession. He would make an example. The threat landed like a hammer. Nell's heart slammed. She had not imagined her small act of defiance would prompt such violence. But the man she had loved in name more than in substance had never seen her as anything but an object to be controlled. He would not be swayed by truth or by tenderness. He wanted spectacle. At night, when the ranch settled and Frederick's men sauntered with whiskey and easy evil, Nell walked to the study and opened the safe using the memory of a birthday Frederick had once thought sentimental, the numbers of their wedding date that had never mattered to him. Inside were ledgers and papers that, under light, unraveled the image of his respectable empire, forged deeds, crooked acquisitions, money moved through shadow paths. She had never intended to use them. She had intended to leave quietly, or perhaps she had not yet decided. But seeing the proof changed a thing in her. It turned fear into strategy. She enlisted Marisol, the housekeeper, whose hands were round and kind, and paid in what mattered, genuine hope and the possibility of escape. Marisol's price was practical, money for her family, and a promise they would be safe. But beneath that pragmatism shone a solidarity that surprised Nell. The housekeeper had watched the hollow heart of Frederick's home and wished for right, even if self-preservation demanded caution. That night, as Frederick sat drunk and triumphant after a dinner staged for neighbors, Nell slipped out. The moon sketched her figure as she moved with purpose, each step a private revolution. She opened the bunkhouse where Caleb was held like a wrongdoer, softened by the lies Frederick would tell to justify a brutal mercy. Caleb rose when he saw her, disbelief and wild hope wrestling on his face. She unlocked the cell with trembling fingers, and together they fled across the corral, slipping past the drunk sentries. Two saddled horses waited like angels with taut leather and patience. They mounted in silence and pushed north under a sky that had no interest in their small dramas. They had not ridden far when shouts rose like a storm. Frederick's men had come to light, and the confrontation that followed sharpened the spine of the world. A rifle leveled, a shouted accusation, the threat to hang regardless of evidence. But Nell had not made her plan naively. In the pockets of her satchel were the documents she had liberated from the safe, proof of Frederick's entire crooked oeuvre, and in her pockets she had another strategy: witnesses. Marisol had done more than keep them safe. She had crossed the line into courage, sending word into town and calling a sheriff who still believed in procedural truth. The sheriff arrived with townsfolk behind him, like a rising tide. He had seen the papers. The power that Frederick thought absolute was brittle and mortal when held up to light. Frederick's rage curdled into panic when the sheriff read a ledger and a neighbor testified about payments for favors. Marcus, no, Frederick found the ground going out beneath him. He swung from villainous certainty to desperate pleading. When the law did what she had once only wished for, the man who had pretended to own her was disarmed. The trial that followed would take months. The territories did not move quickly, but the evidence was careful, and the voices of those wronged were persistent. Frederick's fortune, built on other people's misfortune, cracked and spilled. The scandal that Nell feared and had imagined as a ruin became a different kind of fall. His arrest, the slow loss of his properties, the trudge from respectability to the jail yard. Nell felt no joy in his ruin. She felt relief at the unmaking of a cage. For Nell and Caleb, the escape did not end with conquest. There were compromises and costs. She surrendered her name in practice even before paperwork privatized the change. She became, in the eyes of the civilized world, a woman who had broken vows. In the new, simpler world by the mountains near Helena, she learned a different ledger: how to make bread, mend fences, and be counted on for the small things that compose an honest life. They married quietly when the legal tides allowed, not as a ceremony of status, but as the formal recognition of what they had already built. The town that once would have scorned them softened in time. Many who had watched from porches came with help and warm bread. Some never forgave. Nell accepted the cost of being known on honest terms. The work was steady. The quiet joy compounded day by day. Months later, when the county paper printed a full account of Frederick's schemes and the role Nell played in exposing them, a strange thing happened. She became, improbably, a heroine to the men he had robbed and the families who had their claims returned. The wide world is not kind to women who transgress, but it is kinder to truth. On the porch of a small cabin with a view of mountain blue and hard, good work, Nell and Caleb watched their garden and planned a season. They had no servants now, no silver to polish. Their hands were rough and their sleep deeper. They had traded the golden cage for a wind-worn shelter and a freedom paid for in courage and risk. "You taught me how to ride," Nell told Caleb one evening as the sun tipped the peaks to fire. "But you taught me something else I didn't know I needed: how to be myself." Caleb wrapped an arm about her and kissed the top of her head. "You taught me to trust," he said, "to let someone in and hold her safe." They built a life by the muscle and mercy of their own labor. Every stitch of the quilt on their bed, every fence post they set together, was an argument against the old world's idea that a woman was property. When they walked into town for supplies and saw faces that once would have hissed, some offered nods of respect, others cold shoulders. Nell accepted both. The freedom she'd stolen was not the theft of a single night. It was the deliberate, slow reclaiming of a life. If this story found you at the right hour, if you felt the pull of someone finally choosing themselves and the bravery it takes to make a new path, please subscribe. There are more tales to come of people who choose honesty, who risk everything to be alive. In time, the story told itself differently in the mouths of others. For a while, she was the scandal. Later, she was the woman who forced a powerful man's hand. The truth, messy and complicated, never fit neatly on a page. But in their kitchen, under the smoke-streaked rafters, with fields to mend and neighbors to help, Eleanor Whitby, now Eleanor Mercer by choice and heart, found what she'd always wanted and never thought she deserved: a partner who saw her, a life she'd built, and the clean, wide sky of freedom above. If you enjoyed Eleanor and Caleb's ride from constraint to courage, subscribe for more stories of reinvention and wild places. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that freedom often requires risk, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to choose yourself. Thank you for reading.